Chapter 19, The Duchy, Part 2. The village on the other side of the hill was a drab yet quaint affair. It was little more than a couple dozen stone hovels spread haphazardly around a larger wooden building in the middle of a dirt yard. Farms covered the surrounding slopes, the crops partially obscuring the homes of the families that worked them. Rarity's eye was drawn to the top of the lone wood construct, where the roof had been carved into the likeness of a faceless, spread-winged alicorn. Her forelegs were wrapped around a lovingly detailed brass relief of Princess Celestia's cutie mark. Rarity wrinkled her nose at the display. It wasn't the first time she had seen religious buildings dedicated to the princesses, but she was far from used to it. Neither of them would have wanted to be worshipped as goddesses. She knew this.
Perhaps it's better than being forgotten altogether, though. So this is the place?
Pinkie asked. She stopped bouncing, opting instead to walk along the ground as she looked around.
It kind of reminds me of the rock farm.
Pontius glanced back. How do you farm rocks?
You just...
Pinkie sighed, her mane losing some of its puff as she kicked at a pebble.
Just kind of roll them around. Pinkie, dear,
Rarity said, stepping close enough to rub shoulders with her friend as they walked.
Perhaps you could throw them a party? I'm sure they'd quite appreciate it.
She smiled as Pinkie's mane popped back into place. The mare jumped in place and let out a giddy shriek.
Do you really think so? But of course, darling.
Rarity giggled.
I've never met any pony that would turn down a Pinkie Pie party.
Her ear twitched at the derisive snort she heard from Ivory's direction.
I'm gonna need some supplies.
Pinkie bounced to the front of the party. She turned around to face Pontius as she spoke, now bouncing backwards.
Who's the lucky pony I talked to get some party supplies around here?
Pontius pulled his head back from the unnatural display of coordination. He stretched his wings for a brief moment before returning them to his sides. Cinnamon Twirl is the Ildermare here. Ask for her.
You got it! See you guys at the party!
With an exaggerated salute, she turned around and sped ahead of the group. Ivory let out a low nicker.
Finally.
Don't be that way, Ivy, Onyx said from Rarity's other side. The mare's got spirits all. Pontius slowed his pace and raised his head as the group came closer to the village. Rarity knew when a pony was donning a mask and watched the subtle transformation with interest.
He's been comfortable with his soldiers so far, but he cares how the villagers see him. He wants to be some pony they can speak to, but not one to get familiar with.
Pinkie's distinctive voice drifted through the air. Many of the villagers had had their ears angled in its direction, but they were quick to forget about her once they noticed the young lord in their midst. Most of them stepped out of the path, bowing in silence. Some uttered quiet greetings before returning to their business. None raised their gaze to meet his, but Rarity did catch a few glances stolen in her direction. She did her best to smile at those villagers, only to have them all quickly look away. She suppressed the urge to let out an indignant huff.
That brute Titus must have made them this way.
Although the villagers' shyness towards an unfamiliar noble could be forgiven, Rarity supposed, the felonious grade of their wardrobes was harder for her to overlook. Coarse browns and dirty whites were the dominant colors, and most ponies wore nothing but simple coats and caps. Rarity was reminded of the mini spat she'd shared with Applejack over such attire.
How would she describe it? Ah, yes, practical.
Pontius approached a yellow-coated Pegasus mare leaning against the door to her stone cottage. He spoke with a thicker accent than Rarity had heard him use before. Sunshine, you twirl. Cinnamon Twirl was the only villager Rarity had seen that was willing to look Pontius in the eye, but it was hard to tell if she was flaunting it or just being friendly.
Sunshine, you Master Pontius. How's your father's health?
Duke Titus is in fair spirits as usual, thank ye, he said, giving her a small smile. She didn't respond in kind. Pontius cast an eye over to where Pinkie was speaking with a wide-eyed filly. Yeah, that mare's looking for you.
Aye, the whole village is hearing.
Cinnamon Twirl watched as Pinkie bounced behind another cottage and out of sight.
Lass could find me in 10 seconds if she'd spare more than a moment for each pony. Ain't that many of us, though. She'll get to me soon enough.
Pinkie's cheery tone was moving around the village so fast that Rarity could almost imagine she was teleporting.
Are you Cinnamon Twirl? Darn! Are you Cinnamon Twirl? Drat!
A little smile played at Rarity's lips.
Oh, she seems to be having fun, at least.
Cinnamon Twirl just shook her head before turning back to Pontius.
Yon business?
Just ranging the land, Twirl, Pontius said. He gestured with a wing. Have you met Countess Rarity? Rarity stepped forwards with a sweet smile. She didn't care if she was a noble or not. She would greet this mare like a neighbor.
I've heard many things about the beauty of Barrenlands, but I must say that your charming village puts the stories to shame. By Celestia's blessing, my lady.
The suspicion in the mare's eyes was subtle, but as clear as day to Rarity.
I'm sure the Duke is pleased to hear it. Is there anything my hoof-maiden or I can help with while we're here? Anything at all?
Rarity asked, leaning forwards.
Your presence alone is help enough, my lady,
Twirl said. Her voice had a dry timbre that sat on a narrow fence between wit and exhaustion.
We've our troubles well handled, thank ye. Ah, of course.
Rarity stepped back, a small frown on her lips.
She doesn't trust me. And why should she? She's probably never met a gifted or a noble with an actual interest in her life, the poor dear.
Cinnamon Twirl gave a respectful dip of her head before turning to Pontius.
Lad came in from the east yesterday. Said he was heading to the manor to speak with the Duke. Staying with Mother White if you want to see him.
Pontius nodded. Thank you for letting me know. Farewell. He turned back to the path, the two guards following in silence. Rarity hesitated only long enough to give a little wave and receive a plain-faced nod in return before following suit.
Does your father hold many of these villages, Pontius?
My father collects tribute from nearly a dozen settlements in this part of Altalusia, Pontius said. He fluffed his wings up as he spoke. We've held our position as the most powerful dynasty on the island for over a century.
Ah, I see.
Rarity grimaced as she realized that they were heading for the church to Celestia. She had never actually been inside one of the things.
And I'm certain that you do more than just collect tribute from them, of course.
Pontius glanced back at her, his head partially cocked. Of course. My father and I understand the meaning of fealty. The double doors of the church were banded in brass and built into a frame fashioned like protective wings. One was already ajar, leaving space for the party to slip inside single file. The earthy scent of chrysanthemum tickled Rarity's nose as she entered behind Pontius. Narrow windows of stained glass flanked blanketed pews, resting above lovingly tended beds of brilliant flowers. Depicted in the colored panes, Rarity saw ragged peasants kneeling in prostration, heroic warriors slaying terrible beasts, and humble leaders caught in passionate speech. In each window, the image of a gleaming sun was prominently displayed. Morning daylight streamed in through an opaque window stained in a radiating pattern of gold and white at the far end of the church. The light silhouetted the faceless marble statue of an alicorn, its wings stretched up to cradle the rising sun, while its forelegs reached out as if to encompass the entire church in their embrace. Rarity didn't notice the earthmare sitting with a bowed head before the statue until she lifted her head, looked back, and spoke.
Sunshine, you Lord Pontius.
Sunshine, you Mother White, Pontius said. Twirl tells me you have a lad looking for my father.
Aye, I do.
Mother White nodded. The hood of her gold-trimmed white robe bobbed with the motion. It was without a doubt the most aesthetic outfit in the village, despite its simple design. Her gaze passed over Rarity and the two soldiers.
Shall I fetch him for you?
Please, Pontius said. He took a few steps to the side and sat down on the nearest pew. Mother White nodded once more. Her robe rustled as she stood and disappeared through a small door off to her side. Rarity looked up into the blank face of the Alicord statue.
So this is how these ponies see Celestia?
It felt alien to her. A far cry from the maternal warmth that the Princess of the Sun had always exuded. She thought back to all the summer sun celebrations she had attended back in simpler times, watching Celestia raise the sun in that very same pose, marveling at her beauty and her regal poise. In an instant, the Celestia of her memories became ragged and gaunt. Her pristine coat became patchy and torn, leaving only her rainbow mane untouched in its ubiquitous arcane breeze. Rarity looked up into the blank face of the Alicord statue, and she saw the empty, blood-stained eyes of the Celestia that had prowled the flooded streets of Fellis Island looking back at her. She blinked, and the image was gone.
Don't let your imagination get the better of you, Rarity.
She still hadn't told Pinkie about what she had seen that day. Perhaps she would muster the courage to share the story when she reunited with all of her friends. Rarity welcomed the distraction when Mother White re-entered the room with a young stallion in tow. He stepped nervously towards the pew where Pontius had taken a seat to wait, urged on by her gentle presence. "You wanted to speak to the Duke, lad?" Pontius asked. The lanky unicorn colt nodded, and Pontius beckoned with a wing. "You can speak to me, then. I'll pass the word along." The colt looked to Rarity, who gave him a friendly smile before speaking.
It's about your bounty, my lord.
Rarity stiffened.
Bounty?
She took a casual glance towards the still ajar door and saw Ivory watching her intently. Had the price on her and Pinkie reached Altalusia as well? She grimaced at the lack of usual fabrics in the church.
That little shop had been so charming, too.
"Speak on, then," Pontius prompted, leaning forwards. "What do you know?"
"The bandits, my lord," the colt said. "I can show you where the camp is."
Pontius pointed a wing towards where Onyx was standing. "Tell him where you found it, lad. We'll go take a look." The young pony rushed to oblige, and Rarity realized that she had been holding her breath. She let it go, fidgeting with her mane with a hoof.
Oh, foolish girl, ready to bolt at the first mention of a wanted pony. I had heard that you have crime problems in these lands.
Pontius stood up and shuffled his wings. "Aye, and sometimes our patrols aren't enough. A few bits always help serpent-sealed lips."
I see.
Rarity looked over to where Onyx was listening intently to the young pony.
"And I suppose the next step is to find the camp and then what?"
He shrugged. "Then we bring him to justice."
"Surely you don't mean—"
Rarity grimaced, the words stuck in her throat. Pontius gave a curt nod. "Aye, that. Father's never taken kindly to those that break his law, and even less so stalking him in the dungeon and feeding him. If they're wise, they'll run and not give us reason to look for him again." He paused before adding, "Assuming we can't catch him."
But they're still ponies!"
Rarity insisted with a step forwards.
"They have families and stories. Surely they have a good reason for what they're doing."
"That's not our concern," Pontius said. He exchanged nods with Onyx as the colt finished his story. "A lord's duty is to his land, not to those that threaten it." He stepped back outside, Onyx quick behind him. Rarity stared after him with her open mouth, ignoring Ivory's impatient stare.
How could any pony think that way?
She let out an unladylike nicker.
Focus, Rarity. You can save those ponies.
She shook herself, cantering past Ivory and out into the sunlight. Pontius was listening as Onyx pointed towards a wooded hillside and recounted what he had heard. Rarity fought to keep her face neutral as she approached him, but failed to steady her voice altogether.
Your duty is to the ponies, not to the land, you...
She caught herself before an insult slipped out.
When did the nobility forget the meaning of chivalry?
Pontius turned to her. He cocked his head, a small frown on his face.
Countess, the ponies are the land.
Rarity opened her mouth for a rebuttal, only to find that she couldn't think of one. She knew there was something off about what he had said, but she just couldn't find the words for it. After a few seconds, she settled for an indignant and turned away. The stallions resumed their conversation as she seethed. Pinkie Pie bounced into sight from behind the church, waved, and rushed to close the distance.
Hi, Rarity. Something wrong? It's just... Ugh.
Rarity let out a dramatic sigh. She didn't want to talk about Pontius behind his back, even if technically he was actually the one behind her back at the moment. She felt like complaining about him not 2 steps away would be entirely improper.
Just this world, Pinkie. Did you find a cinnamon twirl?
Pinkie cocked her head. After a couple seconds, she burst into a wide smile.
Yippers! No pony can hide from the pink forever!
She reared up and struck a pose as she spoke, only to break down in giggles a moment later.
She wasn't too cooperative at first, but she gave in after a few rounds of my smile-aggressive negotiating. Party's gonna be in the big sunhouse tonight, and you know you're invited.
Rarity gave her a wan smile.
Thank you, darling. I'm quite looking forward to attending.
Pontius cleared his throat behind her, and she forced a calm demeanor onto her face before turning to face him. His accent had thinned to where it was before entering the village.
We'll be making for the camp now, my lady. Would you like me to send for an escort back to the manor? The village keeps a couple pigeons.
Rarity scoffed.
Certainly not. I shall be accompanying you to speak with the bandits. You're not going to take too long, are you?
Pinkie asked from behind her.
I don't want you guys missing the party. I'm sure we can have it handled and be back before sunset, Pinkie,
Rarity said. She glanced up to the sun as she spoke. It wasn't quite noon yet.
My lady, we aren't marching into the woods to speak with bandits over a meal,
Pontius said, drawing her attention back to him.
They'll know the risks they've taken, and they won't wait to speak to you until you have them begging for mercy on the ground.
Rarity raised her chin, looking him in the eye.
I am not the type of fair maiden that requires coddling to interact with the world, Pontius. If you don't want my company, then you're more than welcome to try and stop me.
An exasperated grimace formed on his face. He glanced back to Onyx and Ivory as if for support, but their attention remained steadfastly elsewhere. He turned back to Rarity only to see that she hadn't moved.
Please back down,
she thought. Although her recent experiences had quite bolstered her confidence with regards to violence, she would have hated to get into a fight. There was just so much dirt in the little village. At last, he relented.
Very well, then. But you stay behind me and you don't get involved. These ponies are dangerous, and your clothes won't protect you from a weapon aimed to kill.
His eyes darted down to her cutie mark for a moment before he continued.
I don't want to have to drag you back to the village bleeding all the way.
A sweet smile crept past Rarity's stern facade.
Certainly, darling. I would hate to stain this outfit either way.
Steam hissed above Twilight's ear as the door to the cargo hold slid open. She stepped through without looking, engulfed in the copy of Callus's classified collections on Chiroterra suspended before her. Her concentration was broken as she bumped into something warm and furry. She flinched back, the book falling and clattering against the metal of the floor as she looked up and noticed Fluttershy.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Fluttershy said, stepping aside.
I wasn't looking where you were going.
Twilight gave the mirror a soft smile as she levitated the book, closed it, and laid it to rest on her back.
You're fine, Fluttershy. It was my fault. No, I should have been watching,
Fluttershy insisted.
I know how you are with books, Twilight. I was just distracted by Rainbow.
Twilight followed the other mare's gaze and noticed for the first time the pair of Pegasi circling each other in the open space beneath Rainbow's cloud house. Rainbow and Sea Sabre both had their wings flared, the feathers sheathed in hard wood.
That's just a spar, right?
She asked.
They're not actually fighting? Oh, goodness, no,
Fluttershy said.
Rainbow's just been so frustrated lately with her training. She kept telling me about how, pointless all the drills were and how, stupid it was. And I'm sure Sea Sabre's a very good teacher.
She shot a nervous glance towards the other two Pegasi.
So I suggested that she talk with Sabre about it if she wanted, and Sabre told her that they could have a practice fight. I see.
Twilight teleported the book into her room for later, sitting down next to Fluttershy to watch.
I guess she roped you into cheering her on. Well, I wouldn't say roped.
Fluttershy hid behind her flowing mane.
I mean, Applejack's busy helping Trails with the sub, and I would just hate for Rainbow to feel lonely. I know just how important it is for her to have a friend to cheer her on. Of course not.
Twilight gave her nervous friend a sincere smile.
I know she appreciates it.
She faced the makeshift arena, raising her voice for a cheer.
Go, Rainbow Dash!
Rainbow turned, her eye lighting up as she saw the new audience member. She waved with a huff.
Hey, Twi! Here to see my new moves?
Twilight opened her mouth to respond just as Sabre pumped her wings, lifting her hooves off the ground and propelling herself forwards with barely a sound. Twilight gasped as she realized that she had caused her friend to leave her blind spot exposed.
Rainbow, look out!
Too late. Sabre hooked a hoof under Rainbow's neck, flipping her over onto her back. In the same motion, she wrapped her hind legs around Rainbow's wings, pinning them in place. Rainbow released a strangled squawk as she was slammed into the ground. Sabre's wooden blade was already against her neck.
You're dead. No fair!
Rainbow coughed. She strained against the other Pegasus's hold to no avail.
I wasn't ready! You were ready 10 seconds ago,
Sabre said, stepping back.
Now you're dead. She distracted me.
Rainbow leveled a hoof on Twilight, who blushed and looked away.
And you came in on my left side, too. I couldn't even see you. You let your guard down, Rainbow,
Sabre said. Rainbow gnashed her teeth, glaring at her mentor. She jumped backwards and lowered herself to the ground.
Fine! Let's go again.
Twilight had her hooves clasped over her muzzle.
Oh my goodness. I didn't mean for that.
She kept her voice low to ensure that only Fluttershy could hear her.
Maybe we should be more careful with our, cheering,
Fluttershy whispered, shrinking down.
I wouldn't want to distract her again. Come on!
Rainbow launched forwards, twisting midair to strike with one wing. Sabre turned to the side, deflecting the blow with one wing while her other arced around to strike at Rainbow's belly.
Ugh.
Rainbow grunted as she sped head over heels and landed face up on the ground. Sabre rested a hoof on her neck.
Dead again.
Twilight had flinched from the sound of the impact.
This is their first time sparring? Well, Rainbow spent her first day of practice sparring with her, actually,
Fluttershy said. She whimpered as she watched her friend throw herself forwards again, only to be bodily flung to the ground once more.
She's doing better this time, though. Go, Rainbow Dash! Woohoo!
Twilight grimaced.
Oh.
Rainbow bounced back to her hooves for the 5th time.
Stop doing that! I can't even see on that side! Did you want me to go easy on you?
Sabre asked. She had only just begun to breathe hard.
Or do you want to learn how to fight?
Rainbow scuffed a hoof against the floor, her tail flicking side to side and her ears flat against her head. She flung herself forward with a reckless scream. The sound of venting steam prompted Twilight to look back, just as Flintlock stepped into the cargo hold. He sat down next to Twilight. Sparring, huh? Twilight let out a little laugh.
I'm beginning to wonder if I should say something.
Rainbow yelped as she was tossed up into the air and vanished into her cloud room with a puff of white.
I don't think Rainbow would like that.
Fluttershy said.
But that's just, what I think.
Don't you worry,
Flint said.
This is how it always goes. Sabre will have her in shape soon enough.
Rainbow darted back out of the cloud before it even had time to settle. He chuckled as she got a hit in on Sabre's shoulder before being flipped off her hooves.
You've seen this before?
Twilight asked. She clapped her hooves together as Rainbow picked herself up off the ground yet again.
Keep it up, Rainbow!
Yeah, I've been working with that mare for at least a decade, feels like.
His eyes grew distant as he spoke, his lazy smile fading.
Hey, that's my blind
Seen her train a lot of good ponies.
Also,
I was one of them.
dead.
Twilight cocked her head at the strange tone in his voice. She thought back to the empty soldier silhouettes that she had seen die in Flint's dream.
Why didn't they have any faces?
The question hung heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't think of the right words. Maybe it wasn't the time. She doubted the surly stallion would answer her anyways. A thunderous cheer erupted from Fluttershy. She took flight, waving her hooves in the air.
Yay, Rainbow! You did it!
Twilight refocused on the fight. Rainbow had practically collapsed on top of Sabre. Her wooden blade was lying against the other mare's neck. Twilight stomped her hooves, lending her own voice to the cheer.
Go, Rainbow!
Rainbow was panting hard as she rolled off of her teacher.
Gotcha. So you did,
Sabre said, climbing to her hooves. Both of them were drenched in sweat.
So, that's 1 in 15. Do you think you can catch me out again? Heavens, I should have changed before coming out here.
Rarity wrinkled her nose as she followed Pontius across a small stream, using her magic to hold up the hem of her skirt. She was dressed to negotiate over a dinner table, and now here she was, hiking through the woods to find some bandits.
Pontius probably would have left without me if I had left to assemble a proper outfit, though.
They had been walking for an hour at least, weaving a path through the forested hills of Duke Titus's land. The canopy kept her from getting a good look of the sun to gauge time, and so she had only the soreness in her hooves to go by. She winced as she stepped in some mud.
Better hooves than shoes, I suppose.
The shoes she had been wearing would have probably been ruined by now if she hadn't left them in the village. Onyx paused as he approached a rocky ridge, prompting the rest of the party to come to a stop behind him. He crept up to the ridge line, poked his head between a pair of rocks, and then returned to the group.
Camp's ahead,
he whispered.
Fire's out, but still some smoke.
So they just left,
Pontius said.
Perhaps they just finished lunch. Should we try to track them down?
Rarity asked. She forced herself to crouch alongside the others in spite of the dirty ground.
We should be close, yes?
Ivory shook her head.
Huntin.
Onyx nodded.
Aye. They'll return before the day's out, probably laden with whatever loot they got their hooves on. We must be patient,
Pontius said. He tapped Ivory's shoulder with a wing.
You take first watch. We'll take him by surprise.
Ivory dipped her head.
My lord.
She advanced up the ridge, tucked herself into the shadow of a tree, and settled down to wait. If time had flowed slowly before, it progressed at a crawl now that the group had reached their destination. After the first 2 hours, Ivory relinquished her position to Pontius. Onyx took up the watch 2 hours later. All the while, Rarity was forced to wait in silence with only the ambient birdsong and occasional rustle of leaves to fill the void. A light drizzle began to fall, and she was thankful that her dress was already so far gone that the water could do little more to harm it. It was approaching sunset when Rarity finally moved to take her turn. Pontius raised a wing to stop her. She turned to him and received a small shake of the head. She glared daggers at him as she swept the wing aside with a hoof and advanced up to the ridge as quietly as she could. Onyx exchanged a questioning glance with Pontius before relenting the position. Rarity was grateful for the mental stimulation as she took her first look at the campsite. 4 thin bedrolls were laid out in the dip between a pair of shallow ridges. Cloths propped up on stakes protected them from the weather, and an ashen pile of wood sat in a circle of stones in front of a small tent. All in all, it wasn't a very interesting sight. Rarity strained to keep herself focused despite the creeping boredom. The orange light of sunset was filtering through the trees when she felt a tap on her back. She turned to see Onyx beckoning for her to rejoin the group.
They should be back by now,
Pontius said. The irritation in his voice was apparent even with its low volume.
We should be heading back as well, my lord,
Onyx said.
The moon's waning, and I don't favor the hike back without being able to see my hooves.
Ivory nodded, but said nothing. Pontius let out a quiet grunt.
Perhaps they saw the lads spot them and were spooked. Let's see if we can find anything in the camp, then we'll head back.
He led the party up and over the ridge, no longer concerned with stealth. Rarity was thankful for the opportunity to stretch her legs as she followed. She didn't know how Twilight could ever stand to sit still for so long.
I do hope Pinkie's party is still going by the time we return.
The camp was of little more interest up close than it was from atop the ridge. The bedrolls were disgustingly dirty, no doubt having gone without washing for weeks. There were a few sacks hidden in the tent, but they found nothing but bread and bruised fruit inside them. As the sun dropped ever lower, Rarity found herself using her hornlight to help illuminate the site while the party combed the ground for anything left behind. This is pointless, Pontius spat. We just missed them.
Perhaps we got lucky and they tried robbing the wrong pony,
Onyx offered.
We can find the bodies on the side of the road in a few days and say the problem solved itself.
Ivory let out a short cough. It took a moment for Rarity to realize that it was a sort of laugh.
Maybe.
Rarity grimaced at the dark humor.
Or, better yet, perhaps they realized the error of their ways and retired from banditry for good?
Or maybe,
an unfamiliar voice called from the woods.
We spent the day sleeping off the cider at the tavern.
Rarity's heart skipped a beat as she spun around. She poured more magic into her horn, revealing the half-dozen dirty ponies that had spread out along the ridge in the fading daylight. They leered down the slope with chip-toothed grins. A breeze swept through the little dip, carrying the strong scent of alcohol.
"Stand down, bastards," Pontius said, flaring his wings. "You've evaded us long enough. Let's not make too much trouble."
"Stand down?"
Emir parroted back.
"Do you think us dumb? We know how your daddy deals with banditry."
"Then you know that this is your last chance to run,"
Onyx growled. The light of Rarity's horn gleamed off the barbed cap he wore on his horn.
"Maybe if you surrender, then you'll get a clean hanging. Ivy here's good with her knots, and it's a league less pain than getting gored in the gut."
Ivory gave an agreeable nod.
"True."
She shuffled a wing over the place where her gun was secured to her side.
"Now, let's not be too hasty, darlings."
Rarity stepped in between the two parties, looking between them.
"I'm sure we can talk this out. No pony needs to get hurt."
A banded stallion turned to the mare next to him.
Isn't that the gifted from the poster in town?
The mare blinked in astonishment.
Aye, it is. We've stumbled on a pretty bit, fellas.
You will address her by her station as a lady, Pontius said, stepping in front of Rarity. She's under the Duke's protection.
The Duke's protection's a few heads short of fair by my count.
The mare shot back. She took a threatening step forwards.
Hand her over, and we'll let you run back to Daddy in one piece. I can speak for myself, thank you, darling.
Rarity stepped out from behind Pontius.
I don't want to fight you, dears, you know.
She offered a friendly smile.
If you just tell us what inspired you to opt for banditry, I'm sure we can resolve the matter peaceably.
The bandits exchanged a few confused glances with one another.
Why is it paying so good for this mare?
One asked.
'Cause she's gifted, you dunce. Stronger than any in the sheets, they said. If she's so strong, how come she ain't killed us by now?
Maybe her talent is talking.
Doing a piss-poor job of it, if that's the case.
Shut it!
The first mare shouted, bringing the debate to an abrupt halt.
Time's up! Let's get him, lads!
Rarity's eyes widened as she came to the realization that friendship wasn't going to resolve this conflict. Thunder roared from under Ivory's wing, the flash of the gun burning the afterimage of the charging bandits into her vision once it faded. Pontius leapt back in front of her and caught an Earth Pony mare's charge. He grunted as he was lifted off his hooves by the tackle, his wings flapping in an attempt to keep his balance. Rarity was trapped in a brawl, and blood was already being spilled around her. The world was a blur of violence. The light of her horn cast long shadows against the surrounding ridges like some sick puppet show. She had to do something.
A lady does not sit idly by.
She clenched her teeth and poured the magic into her horn to summon up the only solution she could think of.
Be still!
The woods fell into an eerie silence. Even the birds had stopped their singing, having been frightened off by the commotion. A pale glow smothered the campsite as every pony around her found their clothes suddenly clamped tightly to their limbs and refusing to let go. One of the bandits grunted as his ragged outfit ripped and dropped him to the floor. He bounced back to his hooves in an instant, charging for Rarity with his horn lowered.
I said still!
Rarity grabbed her own dress in her magic, tearing it free and launching it at the bandit. He yelped as he was wrapped up in his dirtied, silky folds and pulled to the ground. A pang of mourning swelled in her breast at having to mistreat the dress further, but if she was being honest with herself, it had died far earlier in the day. Rarity was breathing hard.
Oh, how does Twilight do it? I just wanted to talk, but I see that Altalusia is clearly inhabited by unruly fools!
She turned to where Pontius and the Earthmare were frozen mid-wrestle, and with the most delicate nudges of magic she could muster, released his clothes. He dropped to the muddy ground with a thud.
My lady? Pontius, darling, please tell me you have restraints.
She seethed. Pontius blinked.
We have rope for hangings. Ah, of course. Hangings.
Rarity took a deep breath. A few beads of sweat broke out on her forehead.
Be a dear and tie these bandits up. Their hooves, not their necks.
He grimaced, but didn't push the point.
Aye, my lady.
Rarity stood stock still as the young noble worked. He first fetched a long length of rope from the satchel which hung opposite Ivory's gun, before beginning to hobble each of the bandits. He ran out of rope before the final one, and so Rarity indicated for him to use the corpse of her increasingly tortured dress. She felt nearly ready to faint by the time he was done. A shaky breath escaped her as she let the magic fade, plunging the woods into darkness, broken only by the last pale vestiges of the day. A series of thuds and grunts filled the air as each pony hit the ground. She was quite grateful when Pontius appeared at her side to steady her.
Perhaps there's some chivalry in him after all. My lord!
The urgency in Ivory's voice helped push some of the exhaustion away, as Rarity and Pontius turned to face her.
Onyx!
The unicorn soldier, despite being free from Rarity's arcane grip, was bent over nearly double against a tree next to his partner. He let out a groan.
I'm bleeding over here.
Rarity pushed off of Pontius and found her own tree to lean against, freeing him to rush over to the wounded pony.
Where is it?
He asked.
Pegasus got a good slice on my belly,
Onyx said.
Don't ask how, slippery fuck. I gave him better than I got, though.
He nodded weakly to one of the bandits. He had fallen limp to the floor once Rarity had released him.
You did good with that,
Pontius said. He nodded to Ivory, then to the bandits.
String this lot together. We'd best be quick.
Ivory's eyes lingered on her partner as she nodded.
My lord.
She began making the rounds at a rapid pace, taking the rope off the dead bandit to work with. Rarity, for her part, resisted the urge to close her eyes and rest. She had learned that restraining ponies that were trying to break free was far harder than making armored dance, and she had pushed herself further than ever before. A weak grin tugged at her lips.
I'm no Twilight Sparkle, but I can still make a difference.
She whimpered as Ivory helped her to her hooves for the walk back to the village. This night was far from over yet. Perched in the trees above the campsite, Anna watched with slitted eyes as the line of bandits was led down the hill and back towards the village. She was glad that she decided against purchasing some light barding when she had stashed her dress back at the port town. The Countess wasn't the archmage that the bounty postings made her out to be, but her talent for manipulating clothing could not be denied. Even just a chest piece might have been enough to reveal her if she was close enough. Anna had never seen so many ponies held hostage by magic before. She filed the thought away for later.
No armor when fighting Rarity.
Then again, the unicorn had clearly been exhausted. Either way, it was a note to consider once Gava finally arrived. She jumped from her vantage point, gliding silently after the prisoner train on her leathery wings. The darkness of the nighttime woods was no obstacle to her eyes. Her hooves touched lightly against branches passing beneath her as she trailed her target. These gifted were odd. They were a breed she hadn't seen before, and not just in terms of power or naivete. She had crossed paths with many gifted in her life, but none had the strange, near-suicidal compulsion for selflessness that these two did. It made her wonder about what Equestria was like before the floods. The Countess and Pinkie had spoken often about how different the world was, and for the worse. Crossed her mind that perhaps it wasn't all an act. She had seen some convincing acts before, but usually a pony smart enough to put one on wasn't dumb enough to try it when it mattered. She let out a quiet snort, confident that the sound of the wind and wildlife would cover her. She was looking forwards to catching up with Gava and seeing if her sister had made any similar observations. She almost felt bad about it all. Almost.